Hello guys, thank you for purchasing our Protection Foundation course. It will be massive amount of information. Even we have a lot of information in this course, hours and hours, still we cannot cover everything in the protection. Protection is so massive part of this sport that there is so much information. There's so much information what I don't know yet myself. Even I have to try to study it and learn protection already like almost 25 years. I have trained tons of dogs to the club trial. I have trained for sure tens of dogs to the national events and also many dogs to the world championships as a helper. And still there is all the time something what I need to learn. There is all the time what I have to develop in my helper technique. There is all the time something what I need to develop in my dog reading skills and also in my training systems. In my way to see this sport is always to try to find new ways to train the dogs, but not stick only with the one way. I always try to use different training techniques and methods for different kind of dogs. In my opinion, you can get better result overall that way. If you follow only one route, then you have to be able to maybe select a little bit more the dogs, depending on the dog. So that tells already us that it's super important for the helper to learn to read the dog. Now as a handler, it's important for you to learn to read your own dog. And for sure that this course helps you with that as well. It helps you to be assistant in the protection training. It helps you to be a better helper, and that's of course our main point of view. But when you understand as a handler also a little bit the helper side of the story and you go through these videos and these lectures, it's gonna help your handling as well. Your timing gonna be better, it's easier for you to handle the dog in the protection training. Helpers need to learn to read every kind of dogs. Sometimes we have to test the thing. It didn't work, let's do something else. So if you are a handler, give space for your helper to try the new ideas like you do as a handler. You can train maybe your healing technique a little bit depending, oh, this didn't work, maybe I try something else. Give that same space for your helper. Your helper tries something in the protection training. Sometimes it doesn't work. But it's important to see what works, what doesn't work. And this is our helper's role, to learn to read the dogs. Why we need to learn theory? It helps for better understanding the dog's behavior. So it's important to understand why the dog is behaving a certain way. Why the dog is angry. Is the dog angry in the protection training because the dog is strong? Or is the dog angry in the protection training because the dog is a little scared? These are the things what we have to understand as a helper, because it also affects how we reward and make the dog stronger in the protection. And also when you understand the theory, you're gonna make less mistakes in the training. You don't so easily go to the wrong direction. And you don't do something without calculating a little bit in your head before. One of the most important thing in theory for me is that we are able to communicate with each other. The handlers and helpers together, but also the helpers are able to change the information and share ideas. And also when your dog goes to train with a different helper, maybe preparing the competition, if you have a same theory background, maybe it's easier to exchange this information. You are able to create new ways in training. When you have a strong idea about the theory, you can get new ideas more easily and you can make those ideas to work. because then you don't use them so easily for the wrong type of the dog, or even if the idea is great, but your timing is wrong in the training or your body language is wrong, it's hard to make that idea to work. Harmony makes protection easy, but harmony is not easy to reach. Harmony means the switches from obedience to bite and fight, and from bite and fight to aggression, or from aggression to obedience, and reverse way. So switch between these different behaviors and emotions in protection, when it's really nice and smooth, we call with the name harmony. And this means that the dog, for example, when the dog outs, the dog is immediately aggressive in the behavior and shows the good guarding if the dog is active in the guarding. Or from the guarding, the dog goes easily into the obedience. It's no problem, because the obedience for the dog is also the way to get the reward. So all these behaviors, obedience, bite and fight, etc., they should be all for the dog rewarding behaviors, that the dog feels like, hey, with this behavior I get something what I want. And that emotion itself already, like the fight itself, is reward for the dog. Or the barking at the helper in the guarding phase is rewarding. The dog feels that I'm still fighting with the helper. Or even silent guard, waiting for that attack, waiting for that rebite. The same idea. Already that is exciting for the dog. And in obedience, that through the obedience, the dog feels that I can get the helper again. This makes the dog feels rewarded, and already that emotion during that exercise makes the dog comfortable there. So why it's helpful to speak the same language? So when we are using the same terminology, is better communication for us helpers. So we can talk to each other, we can talk, hey, that dog is a reactive dog, you know, like doesn't show too much spray frustration in the training, I had tried it, but it doesn't work. But on the reactive side, when you make the dog stronger, the dog gets really, really good, you know? Like using the same kind of terminology and the language can help your fellow helper to do for that same dog the even better training than yourself. That should be our goal as helpers, to help out each others to make the better trainings. Having a nearly universal language allows new helpers to learn much more easily. Now it's not like this, that this is how we have done it 20 years, you know. That's how it's gonna go next 20 years too. When you have that same language, there is the new artist who maybe uses that theory to create again new information, and also they can catch up quickly the basic foundation, the new helpers, when they have that same language and they understand how everything is connected, and that makes the learning new easier. If you haven't learned the basics in the math, it can be very difficult to start to learn with the university math. You have to learn the basic theory at first. And in a Schutzhund, it's a little bit same. You have to learn the basic behaviors in the protection training, how they are rewarded, how the dog typically behaves during those behaviors. And when you see that picture, it's easy to create more and more information and make your training even more effective. Imagine learning to be a mechanic when every mechanic you meet calls a tool or problem by a different name. Yeah, if the tool has in every city different name, it could be difficult to change to the new mechanic stop, because now you have to learn the totally new terminology and the totally new world. So unifying our training and the terminology makes our sport better and our dogs better eventually. Many of the things in theory is based off the Helmut Reiser, their Schutzhund book. What is the book? The behavior part of the book, what I always recommend for everybody to read. It's an old book, but the information for the basic protection training is valid, especially in the behavior part. The training part, of course, comes from the 78. It's not bad to read that. You can still read that part as well, but put your main focus on the behavior part. So the main thing in this theory portion is to make the things simple. Don't try to make it difficult. We don't have to start to analyze the dog's tail position in every situation, or how the ears are in this situation, or something like that. Always we are looking the whole body language and the whole picture, not the little tiny details. At the end of the day, they are not super important. Of course, the details like how full the grip is and how strong the grip is, for example, are important. But generally, when we are in the training phase, we are looking just the whole picture. And we are giving simple names for the simple behaviors in the protection training. And Helmut is often called father of Schutzhund. I guess I haven't done so much research on it, but I guess that their Schutzhund is kind of the first international book around this sport, year 78, around there. So that helped maybe a little bit to spread this sport and also made basic knowledge for the people how to train protection dogs. Then we start with the first and one of the most important drives is a prey drive. Prey drive is not important only for the protection, but also of course in your obedience training it can be very important, and also in some dogs even in the tracking. So prey drive is something that we need to know as a helpers, that's for sure. The handler needs to know that as well. It can give you the first steps how you can start to stimulate your dog on the prey drive, what eventually breeds into playing with your dog, how you can play with your dog better. What causes it to be shown? Movement. The prey drive is always movement away from the dog. This is something what most of the clubs tells for their new handlers immediately, like that when you are teasing your dog with the toy has to go away from your dog. That's the same of course for us helpers. So when we are doing the prey drive movement, we have to show the movement on the prey object the way that the dog thinks that it's escaping away from the dog, what makes the dog more excited about it. And that stimulates a prey drive. That's the trigger stimulus for the prey drive, that movement away from the dog. Sometimes it's easier with some type of the dogs who are a little maybe unsure about your body to put the prey on the leash, for example, and get the prey move away from your body, and that way the dog gets very excited about that prey. When it's very close to your body, especially if the dog is a little unsure, it can make the dog react less on the prey. So what we learned here, this little unsureness always blocks the prey drive. It means that now when you have that young dog who comes to the field, maybe it doesn't always react on your brake drive stimulation immediately. And the reason can be that it's a little insecure about the environment or about you. And you have to see that. It doesn't always mean that the brake drive is super low. It can just mean that that unsureness and that little self-defense wins that brake drive. The brake drive can be actually huge, but it doesn't come out because of that environmental pressure, for example. So what kind of behavior it produces? It produces hunting, bouncing to the prey, biting it, pulling, or some dogs can be shaking, or depending a little bit on the dogs. Some dogs just holds, it doesn't let go. And typically when the dog is on the prey drive, they just want to carry that prey away. It's kind of possessive drive that way, so the dog have the prey, okay, I have it, all right, I go away, you know? So that doesn't include really that bringing back to the handler. So that has to be created with playing with the dog, that the dog learns to be excited during that playing and learns to be engaged with the handler, and they want that challenge again. It comes through the fight. Or the dog has learned that you throw the ball, when I bring it back, he throws it again. But the brake drive itself is just, okay, I got it, I take it somewhere else. It's mine now. Positives on the brake drive is that it's pretty easy to learn. Of course, if we are talking about the obedience training, it's not as easy to learn as with the foot drive. But still, if we compare to like aggression, what we talk about later, like if the dog is defensive front of the helper, it can be difficult to learn in that defensive mood. I mean in this situation the technical learning. Try to teach the dog to heel when it's scared of something. If the dog is, for example, very defensive. So compared to that, brake drive is easier to learn. Although you know when you have a very high brake driven dog who has tons of frustration, it's not easy to learn either. But it's still easier to learn than in that aggression mood, if you understand what I'm saying. Negatives on the brake drive is that it's stimulus and action specific. So this comes from the Helmut Reiser's book, and this means it's very simple thing. The words sounds little kind of complicated, but it means like if you stimulate on the brake drive a long time without any kind of challenge, it means that the brake drive starts to go down. If the dog is on the leash with the back pressure, that frustration keeps the brake drive on. But for example, if there is prey moving, the dog is just free without the leash, off leash, and it moves away a long time. Eventually, when the dog doesn't get the result, the brake drive dies. At least with the young dog. And the other is the action specific. So now if the dog bites after bite after bite and there is no real challenge, again the same thing happens, the brake drive start to kind of die away. So remember that always when you are a helper, especially if you have a lower brake drive dog, just giving more brake drive stimulation, it doesn't always help you. Sometimes the short intensive brake drive stimulation is much more effective than that long, that you run around and you try to give the brake drive stimulation. Yeah, it's moving here, it's moving and moving and moving. And you think that it gets better, but it doesn't always get better with the time. So it peaks here, and then it starts to go lower and lower. So here you see it. During long stimulation on prey, intensity may go down, same with the action. Bite after bite and with no challenge may cause intensity to lower. So like I said, more easily seen with the lower drive dogs. Next drive is defense drive, reactive aggression. What causes it to be shown? Threat from the helper. Typically, we are talking about mental threat. So the helper walks towards the dog from the distance. The dog looks. Whoa, 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 whoa. Reactive aggression. Reaction towards the helper's threat. Or in the fight, the helper uses the soft stick on the dog. The dog gets the challenge, fights more. In some situations, that can be also reactive aggression. But it just goes into the right behavior. The dog actually starts more actively fight after that. And that happens with the good training and with the good dog, of course. But it needs always the threat. The threat from the helper, threat, it can be with the puppy, it can be just a plastic bag on the street, and the puppy sees that black plastic bag flying around. Whoa, 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 whoa. Sometimes this is for typical behavior for the young dog when they see something new. Always depending on the dog. That threat can also cause avoidance, not only aggression. And this why the helpers has to be able to read the dog properly. So when you are training the dog, you have to see those signs of the dog's behavior that, oh, maybe he is not strong enough. And because the dog is not strong enough, if you now threat the dog more, instead of choosing the aggressive behavior, the dog can be like, no, I don't fight with that guy. This is too strong guy towards me, and the dog wants to avoid the helper. And then you should have seen that little earlier, especially when we talk about the young dogs, and stop that threat just a little bit earlier so the dog still answers with the right behavior, and you can reward that right behavior. And we can jump to the reward immediately from here. The helper leaves is the reward. So when we are talking about the defense drive, we don't actually give the bite for the dog. We are leaving from that situation and giving the distance. We are the animal who escapes when the dog shows that whoa, 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 whoa. So this is the important thing what you need to know as a helper. Positives in defense drive is that it's always accessible, so you can always activate it. If you compare that now to the prey drive, in prey drive, like you remember, it's not stimulus or action specific. Sorry, it's stimulus and action specific, the prey drive. The defense drive is not stimulus and action specific because the dog has to be always able to defend himself. So it's kind of natural. So they don't have to always, like in the nature at least, they don't have to always hunt, but they have to be always able to defend if they see something strange. So it kind of, in the good case scenario, it brings more power in your protection training. When it used the right way, that the dog at the end feels always stronger. And if the dog learns to be stronger to defense drive, in a human term I will call that the dog's self-confidence grows up. The dog gets more confidence. Oh, I can deal with anybody, you know? Like if somebody comes and challenges me, I just challenge back and situation solved. Negative side on defense drive is that of course it's hard to learn there, like we explained earlier already during the prey drive. And it's also less safe to use. Like now if you go with that threat and the dog is not reacting, maybe you think that that dog is so strong it doesn't react, but it can be actually the replacement behavior. Maybe the dog is eating the grass or kind of looking away because, oh, I don't see you there, I ignore you. And this is not because the dog is strong, maybe the dog is a little too unsure in that situation. So sometimes even with the puppy, it's like, if you see that the dog is a little bit like avoiding the eye contact with you, it can be better to just reward when they look at you. So when that young dog in a defense drive training looks at the helper, oh, you take the step back and you show that, hey, even with your eyes you can control me. and you are building the dog's self-confidence up. And of course, all that when we are talking about the defense drive training, it needs to happen in a protection training situation. The dog learns to recognize the helper's gear in that situation. Helper has the scratch bands or apron on, and it happens in the training field. What gives for the handler the possibility to always control the dog's reactive behavior in other situations. Nobody wants to walk with the puppy in the streets and it's reacting to everybody. So the handler has to be able to show for the dog that, hey, in the training field, you can really fight with that guy. When we are walking our daily walks, then you just carry your own business. You are not reacting to every person what's coming up, even at the dark. So one of the most important thing is that when you give the bite and when you are, for example, using the threat, mental threat in your training, you have to make sure that the dog switches to the prey. I see a lot of training like where the young helper is moving the sleeve and the dog is still barking and not really going into the clear prey. The helper gives the bite and then the dog is not very clear on the bite because of that, or even some cases doesn't even bite. So you have to see the difference. Okay, maybe in the defense you run away and the dog is barking at you and eventually the dog gets stronger, then you switch the dog to the prey, and now when you switch the dog to the prey, it's important that most of the cases that the dog is quiet in the prey, or maybe there's little noise like you know, but not like a constant like a whoa 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 whoa, or even wow, you know, it has to be more like a catching behavior on the prey. So learn to read that from the dog. The goal of the dog is prey is to carry, and in defense the goal is that you leave. So like I said already in the prey drive, that if the dog is little unsure, maybe they are not switching to the prey. Sometimes it's better to start on the prey. I always say for the young helpers, it's always better to start on the prey, the trainings, and make the training safer for you that way. And when you see that the dog is comfortable, then maybe you are going to the defense side and maybe use a little bit your mental pressure. If you see that the dog is like the cock in the farm, you know, like the strongest dog, the puppy is tail up, always looking everybody a little bit like, yeah, I handle these all situations. In that situation, even for the new helper, it's okay to maybe start on the defense drive. Most likely, that type of the dog who is so confident in every situation doesn't show the avoidance behavior so easily. They actually are able to answer to that helper's threat. So here we see very reactive puppy who is unsure to seeing the helper from the distance. We help this dog, of course, by rewarding with the distance. So the helper is running backwards every time when the dog shows that reaction. Like you hear that wow, wow, wow. The dog shows that initial reaction, the helper runs away, right? And we make it even easier the way because the dog is kind of like little unsure to pull, that the handler actually is running with the dog after the helper. So we are not putting ourselves into that situation, especially when you have a little more unsure dog, that the helper has to always return close, run away, return close, but actually can make that little more reactive dog, that little weaker dog, even more reactive and a little more insecure. So that's why the helper runs away. And now if the dog gets stronger, then the handlers start to come closer. But the helper actually is never coming closer. The helper is just running away. When we are talking about the theory, our goal in the training is always active aggression. Sometimes it happens already in the first session. Sometimes the dog needs to get stronger in confidence and eventually active aggression happens. Now, before I explain more about active aggression, I say one of the main things for me. Active aggression is not only barking. The active aggression is, of course, the behavior before the bite, how active the dog is. Some certain dogs, they don't even bark. They can still be actively aggressive towards the helper. And it's also the behavior on the grip. So the dog is active and wants to fight. So it's that active fight. Active aggression is the terminology from the Reiser's book, and this is how I see it. I see it like the whole picture in the dog's behavior. Eventually, when we have taught the dog the right kind of guarding behavior, right kind of bite behavior, all that together goes into that active aggression category. Often as a helpers, we are reading the dog just before the bite, because that's the important moment, because that's what we want to develop, especially the dogs in this sport. We want to see the dog in the blind who is actively aggressive in the bark and hold. That confidence already in the bark and hold can actually bring more power on the grip, and the dog can be more comfortable on the grip, and the dog is more comfortable in front of the helper also without biting. Then we are avoiding, for example, outing issues. If the dog is not comfortable in front of the helper after the out, why the dog would like to out? So that's why for you guys as a helpers, you are not training only the barking, you are not training only the bite, you are training the both. The dog has to be almost equal in the both sides, what brings that harmony into that protection. So in active aggression, the dog feels the strongest. It's easy to switch to the prey. It's easy to strike as hard as the dog genetically can. And they want to fight with the helper. They want to play with the helper. That's the thing what we want to see. The dog needs to enjoy the protection. There has to be challenge. Mental, physical challenge. But at the end of the day, the dog has to enjoy that game. The second thing, what I want to make the main point for you guys is that this emotion, this active aggression itself is actual reward for the dog. So now when we are talking about the prey drive or defense drive, we are talking about the trigger stimulus, behavior, and we are talking about the goal. Now, in active aggression, the actual behavior is the goal. So the trigger stimulus is basically the situation. Okay, I put my protection harness on, I put my flat collar on, we go to the protection training. Yeah, that's the kind of trigger stimulus. And the dog enjoys already from the car, maybe start to pull. Yeah, I want to go there, fight with the guy. This is active aggression for me. So that emotion and that reward with fighting with the helper is active aggression. Then when we are talking about the barking behavior, we often focus on that part, and we want to see that activity before the bite, what reflects the bite as well. Strong dog with the helper, easier to out, of course, if the training is proper. If the dog is a little answer with the helper, they maybe feel a little stronger when they are on the grip, and they feel more insecure when they are out of the grip. So that controversy can bring out problem. It's not always about that, how much control the handler has. It's often something else. Not only the biting, but the guarding can be reward for the dog too. As a helper, that's something what I want you guys learn if you are a helper. And also the handler, the guarding, the barking towards the helper. The dog can enjoy that almost as much as biting. Sometimes we see young dogs who want to bark and they don't switch to prey. They have learned to be the most successful in that guarding. They haven't maybe learned to be so successful here, so they almost spit the sleeve out and they just want to bark at the helper. They have learned that that barking and that aggressive behavior towards the helper is something what makes them more successful. I gave one real life example about active aggression. So if you think about like a pet dog in the yard, behind the fence when the people are passing by. At first, when that dog sees those people passing by, at first it shows a little bit unsure behavior. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. But the person is passing by. Or mailman. Mailman comes into the gate. Whoa, 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 whoa. Mailman disappears. But the dog learns to be stronger. Every time I bark, that guy goes away. Eventually, when your dog learns the mailman, hears the mailman, already when the mailman's car or bicycle is coming from the distance, they are like, whoa, 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 whoa. They are almost challenging. Mailman, come here, I want to win you again. That's the behavior what we want to create in the guarding. Example of the dog in the blind who can show a little bit at first the reactive aggression and then eventually goes into the active aggression. You often see it with young dogs when they come to the blind. They haven't been so established in the blind yet, so they go a little unsure in like a whoa, 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 and then they go into that active area. And that active area is something what we want to always reward as a helper. Of course, sometimes if the dog doesn't get rid of that reactivity, maybe we kind of block it with the prey, and that puts the dog more on the frustration side. We talk about that later. Maybe it sounds a little difficult all of a sudden like that, but like the prey brings frustration, and that's actually active aggression. So that's why I use it as an example. But often some normal young dogs, working line dogs, they maybe are a little reactive at first when they come to the blind, like you're gonna see on this video, and then they switch to activity, helper rewards that, and that reactivity goes, that reactive emotion goes more and more narrow and smaller and shorter time. So what I want that you learn from that video, to see that little difference between that reactive behavior and that active behavior. The dog came to the blind, whoa, 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 whoa. That was that activity, pushing towards the helper, you know? All right, when we are talking about prey drive and aggression, when we kind of combine them together, when we combine that challenge from that, even from the defense side, we combine with the prey drive, we get more power. Doesn't go in the laws in the math, maybe prey drive is 1 and the aggression is 1, but when we put it together, we kind of get 3. So we get more power together when the dog has learned to win the helper. Not only that it's a rabbit who has to catch and take for yourself, but also there is that challenge from the helper. That together, I use often the word challenge, like the helper challenges the dog, that brings more power. And that's what we want to see in the powerful protection. That's what we want to create as a helpers. When you see the picture, I'm sometimes joking that what happens when you combine Rabbit and Malinois. You get German Shepherd. Okay, yeah, that's a bad joke for German Shepherd people. Now I have to figure out joke for Malinois people. How we get this active aggression? So how we can create the active aggression in the protection training? I can tell you the training methods, but I don't want to tell you the training methods. I want to tell you the laws of behavior, how we can create it. The first is learning through successful experiences. So now you saw that reactive dog and that video. He chased the helper away, or the mailman dog chased the mailman away. Successful experiences, time after time, and now the dog learns to be active, and actually it turns around. At first the dog feels that that mailman or that boogeyman in protection training is challenging me. But once that's over and the dog gets stronger, now the boogeyman can almost turn around towards the dog, and the dog is already, well, I want to bark you away. I want to be the stronger here. It's kind of addictive emotion. And that's what we want to teach for our dogs in protection. Second one, frustration aggression. What that means? It means that when the helper is moving the prey, and the dog is trying to catch the prey, and when the movement stops, the dog starts to bark. And when we are talking about even learning through successful experience, we are talking frustration. These both elements you can see this in the same training sessions. What you have to learn as a helper is to see the difference in the dog's behavior. When there is a more frustration, when there is a more that reactive area, so you are rewarding the dog with the right actions from your side. But frustration is one of the easiest way to use when you are teaching the dog the active barking. When we are talking about the reactive behavior, it needs much more, it accepts much more dog reading from the helper. So the helper has to kind of back up in the right situation, put the right amount of the pressure on the dog and reward it correctly to make the dog stronger. When we are talking about the frustration, it's all about the movement. Moving around the toy or that sleeve, and in my case I hide it a little bit, so the dog is actually showing also the right behavior, looking at my face and barking. The dog barks and the movement is the reward again. And now when we remember the laws of the action, the stimulation and action specific behavior, that we don't stimulate too long or we don't give the bite too often, we are making the frustration level higher and higher, and the dog gets more active in aggression. This doesn't mean, of course, when you are using this frustration aggression, that the dog is getting very dominant. So the dominance comes to that side, that you are using that reactive side. You are challenging the dog and the dog learns to enjoy to win you. That brings the dominance. But we always talk like we want to see the dominant strong dog in the protection. Helper's work is to dig that dominance out of the dog. That the dog learns to put pressure back to the helper and learns to fight with the helper. So like I said, learning through reactive aggression and through successful experiences and frustration aggression, often we use both in the trainings. In the young dogs, you can clearly see the difference in the training session if you are using the frustration or reactive side. the older dog, it's kind of can be mixed up. The third one is conflict. And as you see in this slide, birthday party, in my opinion, soccer game, Sarah's opinion, American football. She made this slide. And then there is a guy who looks like me and have a conflict. Conflict is a pretty big area as well. How we can use the conflict in the training. We can use the handler obedience conflict, not the handler conflict. That's a bad conflict. Obedience conflict, healing, helper stimulating the dog, handler opens the dog to bark, and we create more drive. So this conflict situation creates that frustration in you a little bit when you are human. As a dog way, what we want to see from that conflict, when there is that conflict, it brings more power. It brings more that active aggression. There's two things what I have to choose. Should I be under control or should I go to the helper? The handler demands obedience, the helper stimulates conflict. Creates a third behavior, and through learning, we send the dog to the guarding, for example. And now we have more drive because of that conflict. If we would have just sent the dog without any stimulation, creating that conflict, the dog wouldn't be so powerful in the guarding. Now when we created this conflict, the dog is more powerful in guarding, helper rewards that from the active behavior with the bite, the dog learns that stronger behavior in the guarding. So these two choices need to be equal. They have to be almost or as important. Obedience is important. The dog has learned already. Obedience is rewarding. Fighting with the helper is important. They can be equal. If they are not equal, if the dog doesn't want to be under control at all, you cannot create conflict. Or if the dog doesn't want to go to the helper at all, you cannot create conflict. Or there can be different kind of conflict that we are talking later on in our conflict episode later on. Fourth, import aggression. The reason why we have working dogs is that we have to have dogs who are able to show active aggression, who enjoys the challenge with the helper, but are still stable from the head. Alright, laws of learning. This is something what should be pretty clear for all the obedience trainers. Of course, there is always differences how the people see these laws of learning. I just go this how we go in the Schutzhund book through it a little bit. So we have a first one, what is the most important in the protection is the classical conditioning, and it's not classical conditioner, it's the classical conditioning where the dog is learning the emotional state in the training. And when you are a helper, this learning through classical conditioning for you as a helper is the most important, especially when you are working with the young dog. Once the dog gets older, of course, the technique becomes more important. This is the interesting thing in the protection, how I start the protection compared to obedience. Of course, in obedience, the relationship, the connection with the handler and emotion of the training is super important as well. But we are always looking more at the technical side, even when we start our obedience training, for example, with the food. Then with the protection, already from the start, when we play with the dog first time or we do the boogeyman reactive training for the dog, we are looking not for the rhythmic barking or anything like that. We are looking the emotion of the dog, how the dog is facing the helper, how strong the dog is in front of the helper, how we can reward it properly from that strong behavior. So the emotion in protection is the 100% the most important thing, especially when you are building the foundation in the protection. Like even in the protection, when you are asking more from the dog, you are challenging more, or we can use going deeper in the dog, into the dog's behavior, using more pressure in the protection training is the way how we can maybe get the dog higher in the drive. When we do it properly, the dog gets more challenged, the dog answers with the higher drive. And this is the way how we can build the dog stronger, or we can build the dog more higher in the drive. But if that happens all the time, the way that the dog feels like a loser, then we are going to the wrong direction. So that's how important it is that you have a right type of the challenge. When you are training helper and you are doing the foundation for the protection, you are not testing the dogs. You are making the dogs stronger in the training. Classical conditioning, instrumental conditioning, skill learning, technical learning. Of course, it comes in the attacks. The dog learns the right kind of technique for the attack, learns the right kind of technique on the bite, to the escape, eventually also the guardings, how the dog is supposed to present himself in the guarding, what is the position in front of the helper. Skill learning is important. Sometimes you have strongest dog in the protection, but if the dog is totally barking on the sleeve side, it can show for the judge the impression that the dog is not looking at the helper's face. So the technique is important to compete in the high level in the protection, and that's something what you have to take care of course, in your foundational training already. But emotional learning, more important. If the technique is right, the dog is barking in the right spot, but the dog is scared and it's not active, it's useless to park on the right spot too. So, and it can affect to everything else too. So emotion goes over the technique always. You have to remember that both these things happens always at the same time. So it's not like that there happens only emotional learning or only the skill learning. They both happen at the same time always in every training session. Last thing, today's theory is the training styles, systems and methodology. Like I already talked earlier, the main thing what we have to learn before we go too deep to the methodology in the training or systems is how we read the dog. It can be that you are kind of doing the similar training than somebody else who has done high level result, but if your timing difference for that guy is even 1 second for the same dog, you have a different result in your training, or you move different way, or the dog just sees every helper a little different way and react a little different way. When they see my ugly face, they maybe react a little different way than when they see some pretty boy on the field. So you have to look how you personally affect on the dog. It shapes your training. You cannot copy somebody else's training totally. Or you cannot copy the system the way that, oh, I do 3 times this and then I do 4 times this. You have to read the dog in the training that you are able to do the right kind of solutions, yeah, and you are going in the training methodology into the right direction. So different dog, different training, different handler, different training. So you have to be able also to read the handler's ability to handle the dog in the training. Thank you for listening, guys.